A very good afternoon. We turn our focus to a defining subject, one that speaks to our identity, our journey, and our future as a nation. Kenya's legacy of self-rule. Over 6 decades have passed since we gained independence in 1963, a hard-fought victory born out of courage, sacrifice, and unyielding quest for freedom. But how far have we come in living up to the promise of self-governance? Have our political system evolved in the spirit of democracy, or are we still grappling with the ghost of our colonial past? In this conversation, we look at our progress, the persistent challenges, and what self-rule really means in Kenya of today, especially as we inch closer to the next general election in 2027. Joining me now is Reverend Dr. Eric J. Irungu, a respected political analyst, here to help us unpack this legacy and explore what lies ahead for our republic. Karibu sana daktari to the bulletin.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Can you introduce yourself to our audience kindly?
All right, thank you. As you said, my name is Reverend Dr. Eric J. Rungu, and I am a lecturer of international relations and diplomacy at ZTech University. And I also happen to also double up as the university chaplain at the university.
Thank you so much for gracing us. We start off, we are currently in holiday season, Madaraka Day. How significant is this day to our country right now?
Thank you so much. Madaraka Day is such a significant day because on this particular day we reflect the day in our history in 1963 when we attained internal self-rule. You know, that was the epitome of our ability to govern ourselves as a state. And so it is such an important event because on that particular day, we regained our independence as a state. And it also serves the significance of giving an opportunity, especially to the younger generation, to understand the dynamics of our history, where we have come from, the achievements that have been made over time, and basically to understand our history and our richness in terms of understanding our struggle as a state and where we find ourselves today.
And one of the topics that most people argue that were we ready really to have self-rule in Kenya? Looking back at what's happening between 62 years later, were we ready to really take up our government?
I hold the view that yes, we were very ready on account of the fact that, as I said, the word I used was that we regained our independence in 1963 because prior to the colonization process, we already had our own liberty in terms of the various communities. So they already were used. We had government and politics in African communities before that. So we were just getting to a point and a moment of regaining that independence. So we were actually very ready. If you look at the struggle that was taking place at that particular time, it was raising issues around loss of land, loss of freedoms, loss of independence. So our forefathers at that particular time were very ready. They were very ready for independence.
Looking past at our colonial times and today, is there anything like similar to it? How has it shaped how we are being ruled today?
Of course, there's a huge difference. The difference largely being that right now we are in a completely African-led kind of an administration. But then we can look at parallels, and that is why oftentimes we would look at the dynamics that manifest themselves in a post-independent framework and also during the colonial framework. So we would actually observe that there's quite a huge difference. And of course, on a comparative basis, the two time periods are seeing different realities in terms of leadership and governance, new structures that have already been put in place, unlike what we had during the colonial time. So a lot of progress has been made. But then, yes, we could rightly say that we can attempt to draw some parallels and possibly ask ourselves, where have we come as a state from the time that we regained our independence.
Many African countries right now, not Kenya, but many African countries are currently facing coups. And the leadership in Africa right now is not that, I'll not say not that great. Can we like bear some resemblance to what happened?
Yes, we do have a lot of challenges, especially in the African continent. When you ponder around African politics and government, you will actually see that there are quite a number of challenges. And the parallel that we can possibly draw is the realization that some of the political and governance challenges that we face could have their root in the colonial history of the African continent. One of the challenges that possibly needs to be understood very well is the whole process of decolonization, that we inherited systems that were anchored and built around the colonial enterprise. And possibly in terms of the decolonization agenda, we possibly are not doing very well. And that is why some of these challenges are manifesting themselves. And of course, there being the feeling that part of the changes that we can institutionalize in the African continent is to have violent takeover of government, and that possibly explains the coup d'etats that you're talking about.
So what role did our freedom fighters play actually in us gaining independence right now?
Absolutely a big role, because our independence fighters and our freedom fighters, they consolidated the entire spirit of resistance. They were the ones who went through the challenges that were manifested during the colonization process. They knew where they had come from, and they were the initial, fathers of the liberation, who had the vision of where we need to go as a state. And therefore, they started the entire process of unifying us together. You will understand that prior to the freedom struggle, we largely did not have a prior experience of having what we would call a nation state, where we had several African communities that were drawn together into a nation state. So they were very instrumental at the foundation of our nationhood. And so that is what really served as the basis of the entire structure of the nation states that we have in African states today.
Many will argue, Daktari, that you are currently undergoing ukoloni mamboleo. Is that so?
Absolutely, and that is what in English we call neo-colonialism.
Yes.
The fact that we still have some vestiges, as I said earlier, rooted in the colonial enterprise, and some of the structures and the systems, the policies that were put in place, we have not managed to dismantle a lot of them. If you look at our domestic politics, if you look at our international political interactions, our international relations, and other linkages that we have with the world today, a lot of them still have their root in the entire colonization architecture.
We had multi-party democracy and the one-party democracy. Is it working, the multi-party one, right now?
Yes, I absolutely think that multipartism is working. Because if you look at some of the political challenges that we had, especially in the 1960s, 70s, and the 1980s, we had the establishment and the consolidation of the single party state system in Africa. And in the early 90s, when we started having this conversation, borrowing from the late 1980s, and we now have the clamor for multipartism. Yes, multipartism brought the whole aspect of political pluralism and giving people an opportunity to express, divergent views. I think the question that we should be asking is, how effectively is multipartism working? And does the working of multipartism simply, have to do with how many number of political parties we have? This is a serious question we need to be asking ourselves. I think partly part of the problem that we have right now is in terms of the structuring of these political parties within a multi-party framework and how they are presented, how they are used to present an opportunity for divergent opinions, divergent views. That seems to be the problem as far as my analysis of Africa's democracy and multipartism is concerned.
And Do we currently have an opposition, Dr. in Kenya?
Yes, we do have an opposition, but of course, the reality is we have some challenges with that opposition because largely the opposition is fragmented. If we are talking about the official opposition that, of course, resides in parliament, and that is should be the most important one because when it comes to legislative matters, when it comes to moving motions in parliament, that is the opposition that would really provide a very robust environment. Of course, I want to appreciate the fact that we are seeing the bulk of the opposition, especially within Azimio la Umoja, that of course has been in working relationship with the current administration, and that of course interferes with the entire process of what the opposition is supposed to be doing. And that is where we are now seeing opposition coming from outside parliamentary circles. For instance, if you look at what we had with the Gen Z protests last year, and if you look at what we are seeing with the political formation and consolidation, especially of the immediate former deputy president, that is Rigathi Gachagua, that is where we are seeing these voices manifesting itself. That's why we are seeing voices within the civil society, and other people expressing themselves even on alternative media platforms like social media. That's why all these voices of protest are manifesting themselves.
Speaking of voices of protest, we had a delegation that went to Tanzania and they were actually deported back to Kenya. What does that signify as a country?
It signifies that we are a society that is, if I use the word that the current generation uses, that the generation that is woke, a political system that is woke in terms of seeing opportunities where, let's say, there are atrocities and infringements, let's say, on the rights of other individuals. And the fact that we have always proven to be a very versatile community. You do remember when we had the Gen Z-led protest last year. This was quite an awakening moment even for the rest of East Africa and larger other African states. So this particular delegation was addressing, of course, or highlighting the credentials that we have in terms of a strong civil society, very robust, that has had a space to operate within the Republic of Kenya. And possibly the question that comes in is when there was their presence and purported involvement, especially within the political system of Tanzania, how that, of course, was playing out in that regard.
Speaking on relationship between Kenya and other states, other African states, we had Sudan just a few months ago. It was rumored that they came to form a parallel government in Kenya and action was taken against Kenya. How is Kenya relating to other countries, Dr. Ree?
Thank you. Referring to the RSF factor, the Kenyan administration, not just the current administration, but even the prior administration,
yes,
had always been, let me say, accused or suspected of warming up, especially to the RSF. Remember, the RSF is formerly the Janjaweed militias. So,
yes,
of course, being a factor that is fighting against the current government there, which is, of course, a military government. This speaks largely to our involvement in terms of our international relations and diplomatic relations. And I must be very frank that, in my view, this hinders our perception as an arbiter, for instance, within regional conflicts and regional dynamics. And if I may broaden the analysis possibly to say that it's not just in the case of Sudan, but remember that we also had the issue with the Democratic Republic of Congo,
exactly,
where we stood accused that, of course, we were purportedly favoring one of the sides.
So, where does Kenya stand diplomatically? Because we are known to host like peace talks, we are military conversations. So, where do we stand?
Kenya, let's first remember that Kenya is a diplomatic giant within the East African region. And by virtue of that, Kenya definitely has her own interests. And this is what possibly could be driving the agenda in terms of the involvement that Kenya is taking when it comes to the relationship with other states. What we need to take note of is that, unfortunately, these very, can I say, adversarial stance that it takes in her international relations may actually see Kenya losing out in terms of good relationships with other states, because it might be perceived as a state that wants to dominate others and also to interfere within the internal political affairs and dynamics of her neighbors.
So how is Kenya actually balancing between national priority with global commitments?
That's a very delicate balancing act. The simplest way of looking at it would be to look at the national interests. Where do our national interests position us? Because when we hedge ourselves between global political realities in terms of geopolitical scenarios around the world, and also the national political goals that we have, then we have to be guided by our national interest. And where our national interests possibly dictate that we take a position or a view that is quite distant from what global political realities are showing, then we have to go that way. But of course, we also have to have a very careful balancing act to ensure that we do not also antagonize some of our key allies within the global geopolitical setup.
Dr. We had our first liberation in 1963. What does the second liberation right now look like?
Actually, when you look at the discourse and the literature around, especially Kenyan politics, African politics, many would actually argue that the clamor for multi-party democracy was actually the second liberation. And possibly people would be talking about now being in a space of the third liberation. And the third liberation, as I said earlier, takes the look of now having voices outside traditional established institutions like parliament, where people are able to express themselves and take a stance in terms of political matters. For instance, we are now seeing a very versatile media that is able to raise political issues, governance issues. We are seeing an alternative media space, especially on social media. So today, people are not going to wait for formal political institutional participation. People are ready to go to the streets. Remember, we have a constitutional dispensation under Article 37 and Article 38, which also permits individuals to vent and possibly protest, demonstrate, picket. So they have a voice. We have a very robust civil society. So that is how the new political liberation looks like, where individuals, even within schools and learning institutions, feel that they can take a part in this particular space of essentially pushing an agenda. We are at a time when we are seeing revolutions, and the discussion of these revolutions is leaderless revolutions. That's the direction that we are taking.
But do we really have activism in Kenya, or is it paid activism?
We do have activism. I want to believe that if we are very keen on what is going on social media spaces particularly, and the kind of content that is coming out of social media spaces, when you look at people and what they are posting on X, on Facebook and on TikTok, and the kind of conversations that, of course, X space. All these conversations are pointing to a fact that we have a people that have become very aware politically in terms of what is going on and also in terms of governance issues. And that is where they are ready and willing to raise a voice.
And we saw like nomination of the IEBC chairperson and the IEBC committee. And a lot of controversies have been put there. Are we having a committee soon, or are we having to wait for the 2027 again?
On the issue of the IEBC, that is the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, the challenge we have is that this entire transition is deeply rooted in the challenges that have been manifesting themselves in our political dispensation in terms of the electoral processes and the management of that electoral process. And what we keep on seeing is there has always been, and this is not the very first time, there has always been challenges that have to do with mistrust, lack of, can I say, public trust in terms of those individuals that are at the helm of the IEBC and also some of the predecessor organizations like the Electoral Commission of Kenya. So this mistrust is what possibly is coming in the way. Let us remember that the process is usually a very political process because there has to be a balancing act around the political interests that are represented when it comes to this. So the fact that we're having this conversation and issues being raised about the entire setup and the process, the modalities related to that, possibly convinces me that we are in a very dangerous and very murky path, because we have a very short time when it comes to our preparedness for the 2027 elections, but more importantly, preparedness also for the various constituencies and other wards that are required to get representation, courtesy of the need to have by-elections held in that.
The Finance Bill 2025 is being discussed, right? And
Yes.
online activism have already begun. People saying reject the Finance Bill. Are we seeing, is history repeating itself again?
Absolutely. History is going to repeat itself, and from now henceforth, we will always see this kind of awareness. I think we are borrowing from the experiences that we had last year, where we saw that there was all intent and purposes from the part of the government to ensure that we had the Finance Bill 2024 pass. And therefore, people are now very cautious. People are now very adept at looking at the details. And that's why we are seeing all these voices. So people know what they need, and people now can see that governments can be made to listen, like the way we made the government to listen in 2024. And so, yes, we are seeing a repeat of that until the people feel that the finance bill is responsive to the needs of Kenyans.
In conclusion, Dr. Ari, what is the next generation going to fight for now?
Yes, the next generation has a lot to fight for. The next generation has to fight for inclusivity, because for a very long time, the political space has been dominated by individuals that we could actually say do not represent, the very divergent voices. So inclusivity is actually one of them. They're going to fight for opportunities, because we have a dwindling supply of opportunities. That's why we're seeing a lot of our Gen Zs who are very well talented, well educated, oftentimes lacking opportunities. So they will fight for political spaces and governance spaces that provide these kind of opportunities. They will also be fighting for inclusion, of course, into the global society, because they are in a space that is shaped by globalization. So they will be trying to push that particular agenda. There will be a struggle around identity, especially the younger generation is now trying to carve out their own identity. We have Gen Z that already feels that it is quite different and distinct from those generations that came. There's a generation Alpha that is also coming after it. Mm-hmm. So issues of identity will keep on manifesting themselves in this struggle.
Dr. Ari, for your concluding statement.
Thank you. My concluding statement would be that we need to reflect on our heart and soul as a republic in terms of where we have always come from. And this should shape the dimension of where we want to go. We need to have a very clear vision. We need to have a leadership that is able to articulate well and to be very responsive to the needs of the republic and the Kenyans at public at large. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ari, for your time and company. Here at Ambassador, we'll take a very fast break. We'll be right back with South Sudan discussion.